Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Engineering Industry's Excellence in Siemens, your roadmap to EU battery passport compliance. I'm Ramona Fieser, Associate Marketing Director and your moderator. A few housekeeping notes before we start. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A section and we will address them at the end of the discussion as time allows. If you want to enlarge the presentation screen, you can click on the pin icon on the top right corner of the display. And please also look at the handout section of the panel to download our battery passport white paper and our infographic. Lastly, the webinar recording will be sent to you. Now I want to introduce you to our speakers. Pedram Mohibi is our first speaker in the round. Since 2011, Pedram has been involved in the conception of and successful delivery of track and trace solutions, extending to manufacturing and multi-tiered supply chain across many industries. Pedram's experience of regulatory compliance encompasses leading the entire life cycle. With a long-standing interest in sustainability and sustainable development, Pedram is now applying his skills and experience to identify solutions for the EU Digital Product Passport and other emerging sustainability requirements around the world. Our second speaker, Veronika Capiet. Veronika is the Business Development Manager for the Battery Passport and Digital Product Passport at Siemens Battery Lifecycle. In her position, she focuses on driving customer engagement and strategic partnerships, while helping companies to navigate complexities between regulation and implementation with the Siemens Battery Passport software. Furthermore, Veronika leads the communication strategy and to strengthen the product's market presence. Thank you very much for joining us today, Veronika, and now let's jump in and I turn over the presentation to Pedram.
Thank you, Ramona. Good morning and welcome, everyone. Let's take a quick look at what we can expect to see during today's webinar. We'll look to provide an outline of the regulatory requirement, what is driving the need for battery passports and what it means for economic operators involved in the battery value chain. We'll also take a brief look at where we currently stand with the regulation. We'll also try to provide you with an overview of what a roadmap to compliance with the battery regulation can look like, what some of the key steps may be. We'll also have a demonstration of the Siemens battery passport solution for you during the course of this webinar, and we have reserved some time at the end of the webinar to address some questions and answers. Regarding this partnership, Siemens and Industries Excellence have a long-standing relationship predominantly in the digital manufacturing space, and we have extended that relationship to address the key challenges of digital product passports, beginning with the battery passport. What we'll do now is have the look at the regulation. What are the drivers for the battery passports? There are a set of policy initiatives that come together under the umbrella of the EU Green Deal, and the EU Commission here really has two core objectives if we look at what the policies are looking to achieve. The first is to achieve climate neutrality for the EU by the year 2050, and the very significant benefits that can bring are very significant and obvious. So we're looking at things like safeguarding biodiversity, countering the impacts of climate change, cleaner water, cleaner air, and all of the benefits that one would expect. In addition to that, there is also another underlying objective from these policies, and that's really aimed at making the EU battery industry more competitive, more self-sufficient, and more resilient. The Circular Economy Action Plan is one of the key pillars for achieving the objectives of the EU Green Deal, and this action plan really looks to drive the adoption of circular economies, moving away from linear economies into circular economies, where we have the reuse, increased use of renewables, reuse of materials, and extending the life of products once they hit the market. As is often the case, the driver of change is regulation, and the regulation that gives rise directly to the requirements for the battery passport, which we're going to look at today, are the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products regulation and the battery regulation. Both are in effect. handing over to Veronica here to take you through some of the regulatory requirements.
Welcome everyone also from my side, and thanks Pedram for this basically big picture and overview and understanding of where the route for the European battery regulation is. What I would like to do is delve a bit deeper into the battery regulation itself. We see that on the left side, the rectangle indicates 2027. This is the due date where every batteries over 2 kilowatt hours that are being sold in the European Union will need a digital product passport. There also needs to be a QR code, of course, that leads to the battery lifecycle information. So even though this is a European regulation, it doesn't only affect Europe and industry players in Europe, because the fact is that everyone who is selling batteries in Europe needs this passport. So this is basically relevant all around the world. The ESPR that Pedram has mentioned, the Eco Design for Sustainable Product Regulation, has already indicated that more digital product passports will be coming. So battery is basically the first use case, so to say, but we know that this will be developed across various industries. Some are indicated here below: textiles, electronics, construction materials, but basically many more to come. When we look at the right side, we see the content guidance. So the content guidance is was released basically a bit after the European battery regulation, and is not a legally binding document. It comes actually from a consortium that is called Battery Pass EU, where different industry players and experts came together to basically interpret the regulation. So even though it is not legally binding, it is basically the most detailed reporting specification or the most concrete reference that we have so far. The content guidance has defined already 93 data attributes that need to be in the passport, and they're separated in 7 categories. So they're listed on the right side. You see general battery and manufacturer information, which is more or less clear. Of course, compliance, labels, certifications. We also have the carbon footprint in there. We have supply chain due diligence information, which is quite relevant, especially for the battery production. The battery materials and composition category, and circularity and resource efficiency. These 2 are quite relevant for the recycling. So the goal of the battery regulation, of course, being to have a higher rate of battery recycling, have more circularity and reusing of the raw materials. And for that, these 2 categories are super relevant because there's information in there that helps the recyclers, dismantlers at the end of the life of a battery to really dismantle it efficiently, basically. And then we have the last category where it gets really interesting, actually, is the performance and durability category, because here we have, instead of static data, we have dynamic data. So these data points, they are being created as soon as the battery is being used, right? So an example of a car, the car is on the street and is driven basically, and then data comes out of there. And this is also data that needs to be in the passport. There are still a few things that are not defined yet. So we are waiting basically for delegated acts that will define details of this regulation. One interesting example that I always use is when looking at the dynamic data points, for example, is how often these needs to be updated, basically, right? The data attributes, is that on a minutely rate, hourly, monthly? We don't have information for that now, but this will be very specifically indicated by these delegated acts. Yeah, Pedram, if you could, next slide. Exactly. So when we look at the regulatory status, basically, of the battery passport regulation, we know that the framework is already established with the EU battery regulation coming out of the ESPR, and this is basically the groundwork for the battery passport. And as I mentioned, what we are waiting for now is these delegated acts that are still pending. These delegated acts will define details for implementation, such as, carbon footprint methodologies, how are things measured and calculated, specific guidelines, for example, for due diligence, and so on. And we believe that a potential delay factor is the omnibus simplification package that has basically postponed the delegated act, so to say. This omnibus simplification package is basically a legislative proposal that aims to really simplify EU regulation in one package. It was introduced in 2025, so early this year, and it really aims to reduce the burden, less paperwork, less burdens for the ones who have to comply with this regulation. It impacts regulation like the CSRD, the CSDDD, or the CBAM. What it does not do is it doesn't impact any details of the EU battery regulation or the ESPR. Nevertheless, we believe that the Commission has been very focused on the omnibus simplification package, and thus we believe that as soon as this is finished, the focus will shift back to the battery regulation and to the delegated acts that are pending and that we are basically waiting for. This is not the only complexity. So what I just mentioned, right, the complexity with the uncertainty and the delays of regulation and still missing details is not the only complexity that economic operators are facing here. So we are talking as a solution provider, of course, to a lot of economic operators and potential customers, and we believe that we have gained a quite good understanding of the main challenges that they are facing at the moment. So to say, the bottom of the iceberg, as you can see on the left side. So as mentioned, the first point, the regulatory compliance and the costs, of course, don't have to delve deeper into that. And the second point being the data collection. This is a quite big issue, actually. The data that is needed for the passport is spread across systems. There's a very limited visibility beyond Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers. There's inconsistent data format and also quality, and there's no set infrastructure so far. The data management and standardization is also another complexity and another issue. So there is not one common EU data template yet. And there's the other issue of aligning the internal systems with external standards that are coming up right now. And the last point, last but not least, is of course security and data sharing. So the data we are talking about here is extremely sensitive data, and no economic operator wants to share these data points with just anyone, right? So cybersecurity and a stable and trusted data exchange is needed. And given these challenges that I've just mentioned, it is essential from our perspective to work with a trusted partner ecosystem, so to say. So it's not just about the software and the software solution provider, it's also about system integration. And this trusted partner ecosystem would basically help to once ensure the compliance for the economic operators, reduce the complexities that I have just pointed out and emphasized, and in the end also, of course, speed up the process in time for regulation, because there's not that much time left. Handing back over to Petra.
Thanks, Veronica. With the next slide, we'll take a look at some of the practicalities of the EU battery passport compliance. How we'll do that is that we'll illustrate a simplified battery value chain. We'll step through the processes and try to take a look at what each step means in terms of gathering data, consolidating data, and presenting it within a battery passport. The very first step that economic operators will complete is an initial registration. We see a presence of this in prior supply chain traceability regulations, and here we're looking at things like an economic operator ID or facility identifier IDs. This initial registration will need to happen to identify you to the EU systems. The battery supply chain or value chain will typically start with mining and refining. There is data that will originate from that. It will need to be collected and consolidated. This is typically followed by precursor and cathode active material production. Data will originate or need to be consolidated, followed by cell and module manufacture. This is where the factory and line system operations happen, where materials get combined and we form the cells, modules, and possibly packs. Supply chains will differ from one operator to another. We can have the pack assembly or we can have the pack, and in this case we've used the example of an electronic vehicle. We can have the unification of the pack and EV, and this would be a typical point where the battery passport arises, where the data is associated with the individual battery. Of course, we have the placing of the battery on the EU market. The regulation says the responsibility lies with those that market the battery to the EU or place the battery on the EU market. And this is where the battery passport will need to be available to the public. We then have the operational life of the battery. So in this example, the car is in active use. We will have performance data originating here. We will also have battery passport data updated during the course of vehicle maintenance or repair. After the first life of the battery, move into the remanufacture, second life, or repurposing of the battery. This is a key part of attaining sustainability, extending the useful life of the battery. After its second life, if there is a third application, the battery will live its third life. If not, collection and dismantling will happen. And this could well be a specific industry that arises that feeds the recycling industry for batteries. And lastly, we have the recycling. The battery has come to the end of its useful life, it's broken down, and its constituent parts are recovered to the greatest possible extent. Once we have all of that data, or as we have the data as it arises and it's assigned to the battery passports when it's placed on the EU market, we must make that data available against the battery passport as a unique identifier. And there's elements of that battery passport data which must be reported to the EU regulators. Not all of that data, but key data elements, so that the EU repository will act as a registry for battery passport data. Taking a look at battery passport ownership. So the regulation says if you place the battery or market the battery to the EU, you are the battery passport owner. This will mean different things for different organizations, and we'll talk a little bit about that in later slides. After the battery has lived its first life and we go into remanufacture or second life, the battery passport ownership will change. It will change to the responsible economic operator that's responsible for the second life of that battery. Again, after collection and dismantling, the ownership will change. And lastly, the final ownership will be with the recycler of that battery. And this battery passport data will need to pass from one battery passport owner to the other. A quick look at what battery passport architecture is expected to look like. We saw the supply chain, value chain processes at the bottom, data originating from battery manufacture, data originating from battery use. This data must be collated as it arises. It must be integrated into a solution where the data elements can be associated, filtered, verified. It must be reported in part to the EU repository, which will act as a registry for key passport data. And ultimately, the data will need to be made available in the form of a battery passport, an example of which we will see later today. Handing back to Veronica to look at the composition of the battery passport.
Yeah, thanks, Pedram. So Pedram has already given an overview of the supply chain. This slide aims to map basically the data attributes that are needed for the battery passport according to regulation on this value chain. So what you see here is basically the green rectangles. They indicate where the data is being created or updated in the first time. So when we look at the responsible party for the battery passport, right, as Pedram has indicated, the economic operator that is placing the battery on the market or putting it into service, we can see that there's actually not that many data points that the economic operator himself creates. Right? So there's some data, of course, but a lot of data when we go back in the supply chain, so to the tier 1 pack producer, to the tier 2 cell and module manufacturer, we see that there's more data being created there, and we can see that this even goes back to the miner. So basically what this slide aims to say is that the effort, even though the responsibility lays with the economic operator, the effort needs to be made basically throughout the complete supply chain. It's about collaboration, right, between the industry players in the battery supply chain, and it's about taking the time, given the complexity of of this implementation. And Pedram will later on delve deeper into a realistic timeline for implementation. But just to emphasize here, looking at this image, it takes time to get ready for this regulation. So we basically looking from a software perspective, right? There is 3 main use cases that we indicate and that we are basically currently testing. First one being the data collection, right? So as mentioned, of course, data needs to be collected not only from the supply chain as just shown in the image, but of course also from internal system. And this can be, so internal systems of the economic operator. And this can be PLM systems, MES systems, and so on. The second use case is the data management and the actual creation of the battery passport. So when the data is in place, right, and in line, passports can be created, they can be managed, dynamic data can be added, the passports can be edited and maintained, and of course also data can be verified. And in the third and last use case, we're talking about data sharing. So data needs to be shared, of course. This is the whole goal of the passport to ensure some sort of transparency and traceability. And this data sharing is not only with other OEMs down the supply chain, but also with regulators, auditors, and also a specific party or public entity, so to say. So what we are doing right now is, of course, testing these main use cases with our customers, and what we see, or what we have out of experience understood, what is quite important here is flexibility, in many different ways. So once of course the scalability towards other DPPs. So as I've mentioned in the beginning, the ESPR has already indicated that other digital product passports will come. So we, as a solution provider, we need to be, of course, prepared for that and prepare our customers for that. So we have built the architecture of the software in a way that it can actually scale to other use cases. The second point is the interoperable data integration. Again, a very important point out of experience, that there is a very high complexity to it. The data comes from different systems, comes from the supply chain. There's different standards on data exchange on the market at the moment. So we are trying to be as flexible as possible via APIs, via EDC connectors and Catena X, just to give a wide range of flexibility here to our customers to really implement the battery passport and connect their data points. And the last part, also very much focusing on this flexibility and adaptability, basically, is the hosting options. So of course, we as a solution provider, we offer different options. We can of course host and maintain the data on our side, basically. But of course, we also have customers that, especially the big ones, that of course do not want to give the data away and want to host and maintain the data themselves. This is also possible, basically. So what we have learned basically from a solution provider side is, due to that high uncertainty, the regulatory changes, all of this complexity, basically, we must remain flexible. And before handing over back to Pedram, I would like to emphasize that the software that I've just delved a bit deeper into is just one piece of the puzzle. So for a successful implementation of battery passports, there's more pieces of the puzzle needed, basically. And here we work with various trusted industry partners, such as Index, for example. And then there is, as you can see here on this puzzle slide, basically there's several pieces to it, right? So and this of course depends on the setup of the customer, of their situation, their requirements and their needs. But something that we often see is basically, as it is pointed out here on the slide. So we have a consulting part to it, right? That we hand over to trusted partners, which also includes data collection, strategy, partner enablement, an analysis, calculations. This is really for customers that do not even know where these data points are and how to find them. It really needs help with the whole setup. Then there's, of course, the software part, right? Providing a scalable system and interoperable battery passport and digital product passport system to then be able to fulfill these regulatory requirements. And then there's also the system integration, which is crucial because the software, of course, needs to be integrated into the company's IT infrastructure, ensure data security and interoperability, and all that with also the external questions. So it's really a team effort, so to say. And with that, handing back over to Pedro.
Thanks, Veronica. We now have an opportunity to interact with our audience via a poll, and I'm going to hand over to our moderator, Ramona, if you'd
Yes.
kindly like to introduce the poll.
Yes, of course. So let's jump into the poll question that we have prepared for you. So yeah, now you should be able to see the question. At what stage of tackling the battery passport requirements is your organization? And we have three options here: informing ourselves about the regulation. Second one, we are engaging with supply chain partners. And third one, we are planning the pilot. So I'm giving a couple seconds for the audience to vote. I see already first votes coming in. So Pedram, Veronica, any guess on the results here?
Yeah, so maybe from our experience, what we see basically right now when talking to all of these customers, I would say most of the customers are beyond this kind of understanding the regulation part, so to say, right? Beyond this phase. I would say that the majority is between solution scouting, understanding their systems, and really kind of setting up their architecture, finding the data points, and really the pilot phase. So we are actually engaging in a few with a few customers in pilots already. We are in a few RFI, RFQ phases. So I would say the majority lays between option 2 and 3, but very, very curious to see what the audience says.
Yeah, let's look at the results. I think we have a good amount now. So I'm going to share the results here. So we have 63% informing ourselves about the regulation. We have 29% for we are engaging with supply chain partners, and 8% we are planning the pilot. So
Thanks for that.
yeah, thanks for voting. So it looks like still a lot of information is needed about the regulation. I hope that's helpful here in the webinar.
So it's good that we're doing this webinar basically to inform, to giving you these information.
Yeah, certainly. I think in our experience of prior supply chain regulation, my gut feel would have been probably as the result that we've seen. I would have said the majority are still exploring the regulation, and I imagine people are going to be very, very busy when it comes to 2026. But let's take a look at the roadmap. That's one of the elements we wanted to convey today. So if we look at the end of this roadmap first, the star there represents the compliance deadline, which currently stands at February 2027. And if we look at where we are now, which is approaching Q3 2025, it looks like we have a lot of time to prepare. What we're looking to illustrate here is some of the key milestones which one will have to navigate, one will have to complete in order to reach compliance. These milestones will largely be the same for everybody. What will be different is the durations for these, the emphasis that you place on these, or maybe even the order of these. This will be dependent on your supply chain processes, the level of engagement and data sharing that you have in place, and the data elements which you have in place. So milestones, I think, will be very similar, but durations and positions may be different. Looking at where we start. So if we start as of Q3 2025, we should start by an in-depth analysis of our battery supply chain. And obviously this would be the batteries which are being produced for the EU and are subject to the regulation. Analyze the supply chain, understand the sources, understand the processes which are being executed. This is very, very, very often overlooked until quite late in the day. It is not as obvious as one may expect. And I think this is a good question to ask oneself right now is how well do I know my extended supply chain? Who is supplying me? What are the processes that are happening? And another thing to be cognizant of is that by factory location, supply chains can look different. By battery chemistry and battery model supply chains can also look different. So really, starting point is get an in-depth analysis of your supply chain. How am I producing? What are the sources? Who are the participants? What role are they playing? And importantly, where do I stand in terms of legal compliance when it comes to the battery regulation? Then looking at your data sources. So we saw the slide, there are different steps where data originates. The big question to ask is, where in my supply chain is the data originating? Is the data I need currently present? In what format is it, and am I able to receive it? Not straightforward questions to answer, because they will originate from different stakeholders in different supply chains, depending on your processes. Different suppliers will have different stages of maturity in terms of the data they're able to capture and the data they're able to share. They will have different data models which they employ, different systems which they use. So analyze it, get to understand what the data sources are all the data elements present, what are the gaps that need to be filled in terms of data sources and in terms of data integration. Engage with your supply chain partners to make the necessary changes. This one will be one of your longest lead time, highest effort, highest impact activities, is really get to the bones of what are you sending to me? What am I sending to you? What format are we using? How do we start? How do we test it? How do we ensure that it's in place by February 2027? Engage with your supply chain partners and do so early with a clear remit. Engage your solution partners. One thing that has become very apparent to me the more I delve into the regulation and solutions for our customers and our partners is that it's very, very unlikely that a single entity will be able to service all of the requirements that arise as a result of the regulatory requirement. You will very likely need to engage partners for various elements of this roadmap. Identifying the right partners, going through the selection process and ensuring that you've made the right decision is something that should happen early on. Here I've shown it overlapping with supply chain partners because I believe the work with the supply chain partners is actually longer lead time, but equally important is finding the right solution partners from right across the solution that you need to put in place. Once you have your partners identified, once you have your scope identified, because you know your supply chain, you know your data sources, you know the changes that need to be made, define and execute a pilot. Pilots can be very beneficial if they are well thought out, if you know exactly what outcome you want to verify with a pilot, and you have a clear idea of the lessons you want to learn. Pilots should not be speculative. This is a mistake we often see. Pilots should be well considered, well thought out, and should have a definitive outcome in mind before the pilot is undertaken. Define and execute a pilot. This pilot will be a big eye-opener for you. You will learn important lessons in terms of what you had preconceived as being needed for the battery passport. You will identify some places will need more attention, some places that may need less, and you will also importantly learn lessons about your own supply chain processes and infrastructure and where you need to focus your energies. Once you've executed the pilot, you have your outcomes, consolidate, review the outcomes of that pilot, take one last opportunity to really assess and then plan looking forward. Plan looking forward in terms of what you're going to do in terms of implementation to gather the supply chain data, to integrate it, to present it in a battery passport, to be able to capture the data from the value chain and to be compliant. If we put all of these together on a roadmap, as we see here, and I think in practice, some of these milestones will take longer, some may take shorter, but really February 2027 is not as far away as it seems when we look at the milestones individually laid out on a roadmap. Looking at your supply chain mapping and your data sources. So the two first milestones that we saw, really this is very significant because this, using a project analogy, gives you your requirements, gives you your initial requirements. And data sources of particular importance which are not present today from our experience and a recent trip to China, where many of you will have extended supply chains, is that for the manufacturing part, the data is captured meticulously. It's present. Batch traceability exists from raw material to a finished cell or a pack. This data is largely captured. What format it's in and is it shareable for you? Can you digest it? That's a different question, but the data is captured. What you will find are things like carbon footprint values. Those are not widely practiced today in terms of capture and sharing. What you will find is that supply chain due diligence today does not occur widely. Visibility of the supply chain beyond tier 1 today does not really occur. These are elements, these are the gaps within your supply chain data sources that you will soon recognize. I'm confident of that. And these are areas where you will primarily place your energies, filling those data gaps. So really map your supply chain, understand what the steps are, map that against the data that's arising, or the data arising, map it against the regulatory requirement, ensure that you're capturing those data elements, you know where they're coming from, they're in the suitable format, and you're able to receive, ingest, and consolidate that data in order to be able to present it against the battery passport. So once you identify your sources, we get to the point of sharing, integrating, and consolidating that data. And this means interoperable data models. It means suitable solutions in place for integration and validation. Here, a very simplified view of a supply chain, not quite a value chain, because we're not looking at the entire loop for the battery operational life. We're looking at the production of the battery. On the left, you have your miners and refiners. They're capturing data. Some of these providers will be able to capture the data that you need. Some may have gaps. You have your refining. Again, some will have the data elements, some will not. You will have your PCAM and CAM production. Similarly, you may have data gaps. You will have cell, module, and pack manufacture. And this simply illustrates that there are various nodes in your supply chain which will need to successfully and interoperably exchange data in order for it to accumulate in your system and against your battery passport. Delve into your supply chain, understand the sources, understand how to integrate it, agree an interoperable model. A year and a half begins to look like not very long at all when we consider these requirements. You will also have scenarios where there will be data failures. And the big question is, how do we address those data failures? Do we reprocess? Do we re-request? How do we note these data failures? These are, again, big integration and validation questions which one must answer. And we really must analyze, we really must engage, and we really must pilot in order to be able to answer these questions effectively. So a little bit about engineering industries excellence as a service integrator for supply chain traceability. So within industries excellence, we have 4 key pillars in terms of our expertise, in terms of our products and services. Digital engineering really looks at the design of pre-production. This could be solutions for effective manufacture. It can be things like product lifecycle management, which are particularly applicable for battery passports. It can be things like automation solutions. We have digital manufacturing practice, which is the actual act of executing production. So here we're looking at manufacturing execution systems, MOM systems, quality management systems. Again, all systems which would be, or primary systems relevant in the manufacture of products such as batteries. We also have our digital supply chain practice. This is the part of the business that my team resides within. And here we can build things like supply chain visibility. We can implement the distribution elements, if necessary, the integration elements. And this is where primarily our supply chain traceability expertise lies. Above all of these, we have a horizontal practice, which is our simulation practice. And simulation will allow you to really try things out in silico, in the virtual world, before you do so in the real world. and it can also play a big part in the digital twin requirements of battery manufacture, battery distribution, mapping your supply chain, understanding data sources. There are various elements that, or various challenges that simulation can actually help to address. Next, prior to the battery regulation in ESPR, there were other significant supply chain traceability regulations enacted by the EU Commission. Good examples where industry's excellence can draw direct experience from are the EU Falsified Medicines Directive. This was regulation that was introduced to combat the threat of falsified medicines within the EU market. There was regulations to serialize, to report, and to enable verification of the pharmaceutical products that are placed on the EU market. This is something Index was extensively involved in and participated in the implementation of the compliance solutions for 19 of the leading 20 pharmaceuticals globally. The other good example is the Tobacco Products Directive, which is, to our knowledge, the most stringent supply chain traceability regulation which exists today. And it really made the tobacco supply chain transparent from the point of production through the extended distribution and to retail. And this is something that Index were involved in right from the outset. And we have been responsible for the conception, design, and implementation of the solution for one of the leading tobacco companies globally. And after the EU compliance, this solution has been extended to global supply chain traceability compliance. When we look at the EU battery regulation, when we look at ESPR, there are parallels which we recognize immediately, and there are experiences which we take from the previous regulations, which we apply directly and informs our approach to compliance directly. So second opportunity to interact with our audience and our second poll question. So handing back to Ramona.
Yes, so let's jump into our second poll for today. And you should be able to see this now. Have you considered the benefits that the battery passport can bring beyond compliance? And again, we have 3 options for you to choose from. Yes, we're considering benefits. No, we are just getting started. No, but this has given me an idea. So let's see what the audience will say. Give it a couple more seconds here. You see the answers are coming in. Okay. All right, I'm going to share the results now, and we see that we have 38% for yes, we are considering benefits, 50% no, we're just getting started, and 30% no, but this has given me an idea.
Thanks, Ramona.
Great.
So we spoke about Index's previous experience of supply chain traceability solutions. And of course, the primary objective is compliance. If we don't comply, we don't have access to the EU market. However, when you make an investment of time, effort, resources, and money in achieving compliance, there is a big imperative to leverage that investment to realize additional business benefits, to realize additional value. And this is something that can and should be built into your objectives at the outset. Don't only think about the compliance, also think about the additional benefits. And part of those benefits can come from early adoption. And this is particularly true when we look at the commitment to sustainability and ethical practices. This is expected to be, you look at various sources, and particularly the EU themselves, this is expected to be a driver for future decision making when it comes to consumers. What do they purchase? They're expected to be more conscientious when it comes to sustainability and ethical practices, and also partners and investors. People will make decisions about where they place their money, whether it's their own consumption or whether it's for investment purposes or partnership purposes, to those that demonstrate a commitment to sustainability. by establishing the solutions to gather your battery passports compliance data or digital passport compliance data, you will be able to fundamentally and clearly demonstrate your commitments to sustainability. You will be able to do so in terms of the visibility of your extended supply chain, certifications, and things like supply chain due diligence. Supply chain traceability and insights are another great business benefit. You will be able to gather a wealth of supply chain data when you have your supply chain traceability solutions in place. And once you apply something like analytics, an analytics perspective to that data, you can gain very beneficial insights. Another key element is engagement. The battery passport will be scanned by consumers, an end user. And there is mandatory data and there is optional data against the battery passport. And you can be conscientious in terms of what optional data you share. And you can be specific in terms of the engagement you want to establish with the consumer of your product. I will leave that to your imagination in terms of what you can do, how you can engage with customers. But there is an opportunity to do that. Beyond what is mandatory, there are optional and additional elements that you can add to your battery passports, to your digital product passports, to enable a level of engagement with customers. Now we take a look at the battery passport solution itself. So what you should see here on my screen is the dashboard. You see limited data here because this is a demo system with a battery set out, but here you would get a dashboard and some key information about the battery passports that you are maintaining. Here you're able to select some active battery passports, and what I will do firstly is I will put this QR code on screen and I will leave it here for a few seconds. If you have your smartphone with you, feel free to point it at the screen. You will receive a URL. Click on that URL, and that will take you to the web version of the battery passport, which I will be showing during the demo. And this will allow you to interact with the battery passport in the same way that a member of the public would when they scan the battery passport QR code on the battery that they have purchased. Another second or two to give you an opportunity to scan that. And then let me take you through the battery passport itself. So we saw the data categories that need to be captured, and they are accessible here via these tabs. You will see general battery passport data being displayed here, and let's take a walk through the categories. So general battery passport data, we will have some identification data. This is the specific ID, manufacturing date, location, material composition. So this is pretty key in terms of circularity. One of the challenges today is that in order to understand the composition of the battery when it comes to recycling, second use or second life, there has to be sometimes for recycling, the battery has to be broken down to understand that. With the battery passport, you will have the in-depth data that you're looking for in respect of battery chemistry and its contents. You will have that visible to you with the scan of the QR code. And you can decide whether the battery is for you and what processes it should be subject to. Carbon footprint, of course, a key element in terms of sustainability and limiting the impacts of climate change. And this carbon footprint total value is broken down into its constituent parts. At which stage of the battery supply chain did the different elements or percentages of this carbon footprint originate? And we have links embedded into the battery passport, some of which I will show you. These are live links which you can navigate to. Circularity. So this data is key in terms of making the battery more serviceable, making it more repairable, which would extend the life of the battery, hence make it more sustainable. And in terms of being able to dismantle it, whether that's for repair or recycling. again, gives you this data upfront before you actually tackle the battery itself. End of life data, renewable content data, recycled content data. So renewable content applies to the elements of the battery composition which come from renewable sources. This could be things like the plastic that's used for separators. It could be binders from renewable sources. Then you have recycled content. This refers to the battery chemistry and really the elements which we focus on recycling, which we focus on being able to retrieve in terms of waste, whether that's production waste or whether that's from waste batteries. And you'll see the definitions here are by pre-consumer and post-consumer for the battery chemistry. Pre-consumer being recycled material from things like production waste or batteries which did not make it to the market. And post-consumer, it comes from battery waste. Again, important data as these requirements are specified within the regulation. Supply chain due diligence. So what you see here, these are largely coming from existing EU regulation. These are things like the EU taxonomy regulation, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. These are associated sustainability regulations which will need to be, which the compliance of needs to be linked to your battery passport. And the same with your due diligence report. These are really the ESG considerations. Are your materials, coming from reputable sources? Are they minimizing impacts on the environment? Some compliance data, again, EU Declaration of Conformity is existing EU regulation. You have to demonstrate the conformity. You have to show the reports from auditable third parties. And there are some, this is data that should exist if you're already manufacturing for the EU market. And this is your battery specific data here. Performance data. So this is the dynamic element of the battery passport. The rest is largely static, except in the scenario where the battery might be repaired and elements of it might be replaced. Otherwise, this is the dynamic elements of the battery passport. This will come from the sources of data here will be things like the battery management system for the battery pack. It will be things like servicing and maintenance, and if exception processes occur. So this is really value chain data that's arising rather than supply chain data. And you can take a look at things like capacity, energy, state of health of the battery. This is really key for consumers because when you look at things like EVs or you look at standalone batteries, such as for energy storage systems, the value of the battery is related to its performance and to its state of health. And instead of guessing that, you have a real-time view of the performance of that battery and what you can expect to get out of that battery before you buy it. So this is really key for consumers and also key in terms of the second life and second use of the battery. Various other data elements here, but I think we can wrap up the demo to leave time for the question and answers. Last things to show, the interaction history. What you see here as examples of data that's been updated and who did it. This would be from different sources. And lastly, export. You're able to export the entire contents of your battery data in terms of field and value into another format if you want to share it or if you want to inquire further about it. So if we go back to the presentation, we have 5 minutes or so for our Q&A. And I think I hand back to Ramona.
Yes, thank you, Pedram. Thank you, Veronica. So now it's time for Q&A. Please type in your questions in the Q&A section and I will read them. I already see a question coming in here. So how long does it take to do an implementation?
I think maybe I'll tackle this one, Veronica. So we try to illustrate that with the roadmap slide and the milestones which everybody will need to tackle but the duration and complexity of those milestones will differ depending on your individual supply chain. I would say we need to get started. You're looking at a year and a half, minimum, I would say 1 year. Unfortunately, our experience of the EU regulation is that you will have some early adopters who have already started looking at this, might be in pilot phase. You will have those that are starting with just about enough time, which would be now. And you have those that will start to look at this sometime in late 2025 or maybe even early 2026. And really, we would encourage you to do so now. Start to look at what the regulation means for you and try to plot out how much time you will need to be compliant.
Yeah, maybe just to add upon that, 100% emphasizing what Pedram has said. We also see from experience that very often there's other burdens that come up in the process. So there's very often, as I've shown on the slide, right, the bottom of the iceberg, we always it always comes in delays, whether that is finding the data, assessing it, calculating, finding the right places, setting it up. So yeah, 100% underlining what Pedram said, we would really also encourage you to start as soon as possible with the implementation.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple of other questions coming in. One I see here is, any idea on when the delegated act will be published for carbon footprint calculation?
I
Very
think, unfortunately,
yeah,
at the moment, I think your guess would be as good as ours. Veronica, I think worthwhile reiterating the likely impact of the simplification omnibus. But yeah, perhaps I'll leave this one to you.
Yeah, it's a very good question, but to be honest, we don't have a specific answer on that. So this is what, this is one of these kind of complexities, uncertainties that we're dealing with. But what I can say is that we, from a software perspective, try to be as flexible as possible to adapt to that. And this is basically the only thing that we can do to stay really flexible and adapt to all of these changes and updates that will be coming.
Yeah. And I think if we draw on our experience of previous regulations, the compliance date seldom moves. What happens is that clarifications tend to be made iteratively. They tend to be made in versions. We were expecting technical specifications, at least the first technical specifications, in February 2025. We understand one of the reasons that's been delayed is because of the focus on the simplification omnibus. But essentially, we will have these clarifications in the coming months, and pilots can start with an outline understanding. And once you have the fundamentals in place, you can refine those as the clarifications arrive.
Yeah, and maybe just to add upon that, this is where the content guidance is quite relevant and helpful, because it gives kind of a basis understanding before even these pending delegated acts will arise. Yeah.
Great. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So what is the most important thing to focus on from importers' perspective when importing battery packs?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I can start here, and Pedram, you can add your viewpoint. But of course, it really, I would say, one focus is to look at the relationship of your supply chain. You need to be aware of who are you working with, and whether the data points that you will be needing to be compliant with the regulation to even sell the batteries with these packs implemented in them on the European market. And this is something that you should probably have a good understanding before even engaging in these in kind of buying the packs and then aiming to sell them on the market. Because what we see is really that these relationships between tier 1, tier 2, between suppliers within the battery supply chain are more relevant now than ever, because the economic operator won't be able to hand out all of these data points alone. There is this crucial collaboration necessary, the help of the supply chain, of the economic operators. So a good relationship and a kind of a transparency basically is important. Yeah. Pedram, anything to add here?
Yes. Certainly, I will add something quickly. So as an importer, you would look at it and you would say the hard part is done. I have to present the data, I don't have to gather the data. And that's largely true. The entity that's manufactured the pack will need to provide you with the battery passport data. I think the challenge you will have is that because you're not in control of that supply chain, it becomes your responsibility to ensure that that data is complete and that it's compliant in terms of recycled content, in terms of renewable content, in terms of the chemical composition. There are engagements that you should make early, and this goes back to analyzing your supply chain, engaging with your partners to set the conditions that's needed, even though you're not gathering that data yourself.
Yeah,
Great. I think let's have one more question. What are the roles of European authorities in the value chain, especially when there is a change in the vehicle ownership?
Sure.
Pedram, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, let me try. So the role of the EU authorities is expected to be, as far as the value chain is considered, a passive one. They won't be actively involved in making sure that when you issue the battery passport, the data is there. What they will do is, or they're not responsible for any data elements. What they will do is monitor the data via the EU registry to ensure that the compliance is there. How they do this specifically is not visible to us, is not publicized by the EU at this stage, may never be, as we saw with the EU FMD TPD regulation. There is no transparency on how they monitor compliance and regulate the market, but that's the purpose of it. That's the reason that they ask the battery industry and the extended value chain to gather the data so that they can monitor and enforce the conditions that they have set for sustainability.
Yeah. So just to add upon that, economic operators must be prepared that passports at some point will be audited by the European Union. So the committee will, of course, not all of them, but there will be some audits happening. So as Pedram pointed out, it's a passive role, but nevertheless something quite important to be able to really ensure that these passports are truthful, filled out, and ensure this compliancy.
Great. Thank you.
So Ramona, I think just before we close, worthwhile mentioning this event. I'm happy to speak about it. So
yes,
we have a joint event with Siemens coming up on June 26th for a select group of attendees, 20 attendees. We must keep the numbers limited. This will be an opportunity to see Siemens digital manufacturing solutions in practice, and there will be a particular focus and breakout sessions for battery passport solutions. If you're interested, please contact Ramona. We will consider all inquiries to participate in this session, but there are 20 spaces which we will be filling with select attendees, and we very much look forward to meeting you in person. Thank you very much for your time and attention today.
thank you, Pedram. Thank you, Veronica, for the lively discussion. This is all the time we have today. For all the questions we were not able to answer, no worries. We will reach out to you by email to make sure to answer them. Also, please make sure to download our battery white paper and infographic from the handouts section. And also, please take part in our survey after the webinar. We would love to get your feedback. We know your time is valuable. On behalf of the team, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Have a great day and goodbye.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Goodbye.
Cheers, everybody.